Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to OceanX Live. I'm Micah Chance. I'm a member of the digital team at OceanX. OceanX is a mission to explore the ocean and bring it back to the world. We're currently working with the National Center for Wildlife on a research expedition in the Red Sea. This is the Red Sea Decade Expedition. And this is all about building a complete picture of the habitat, thoroughly characterizing it, which includes the megafauna. So this evening, we're really excited to hear from Dr. Nick Pilcher. He's a senior advisor to the National Center for Wildlife, where he guides the design and implementation of marine conservation science and conservation measures. He's on board the research vessel OceanXplorer right now out in the Red Sea. And tonight he's going to give us a look into how megafauna surveys on this expedition are designed and carried out, as well as how megafauna surveys can be used as a conservation tool. We'd like to give a thanks and a hello to our guests on the call from the biology department from Imam Abdulrahman bin Faisal University. Hello and welcome to you all. And a final note, we'll have time at the end for questions, so be thinking of those. And without further ado, over to Dr. Nick Pilcher on OceanXplorer.
Excellent, thank you very much, and good day to everybody. I hope all goes well wherever you are in the kingdom. As you've heard, I'm out on a ship, and I'm going to do my very best to give you a little bit of an introduction to the work that we're doing looking at megafauna here in the Red Sea. So when we talk about megafauna, what sort of species come to mind? Can any of you think of any large marine species that might be swimming around in the Red Sea? I'll give you one idea. Sea turtles, those are my favorite. I'm a sea turtle biologist by training. And so we've got sea turtles in the Red Sea. We also have dolphins, a number of different species of dolphins. We have whales, very large whales also found in the Red Sea. A number of different large shark species, and those are both shallow water, so living very, very close to the shore, and also deep water, so found out in 200 to 500 meters water depth, so quite deep. Anything else come to mind? Can you think of any other large species that we might find? Well, so one of them that is quite a unique species is something called a dugong. And a dugong is, it's a marine mammal. It's in the same family as dolphins and whales, or in the same group of animals. But it's quite unique in that there are only 3 species of these ever known, and one of them has already gone extinct, so there are only 2 left. And the dugong is unique in being completely marine, so it spends its entire life out in the ocean. It never goes into rivers or anything like that. And another one that might not have come to mind initially are large rays. People call them stingrays because some of them have a stinger on their tail. Although stingray as a norm probably isn't quite that accurate because not all of them are stinging. But large rays, and I can show you some pictures of those. Right here we have some pictures of dolphins, we have pictures of whales, large whale shark. So this is actually a fish, but it's a shark. It's a very large one, probably about the size of 2 cars put together. We also have a picture of a dugong, quite a unique species for Saudi Arabia, and a very large oceanic manta ray, the big black looking thing that's down here. So those are some of the big species that we're looking at during these surveys. You might be wondering why on earth would we do this? Why do we want to do this? And what we do as a group of scientists, if we want to drive conservation, is one, we need to know where animals are found. If we don't know where they are, we can't do very much to save them. And so the most important thing is to find out where they are. And surveys like the one we're doing can answer those questions. This graphic that you can see here on the screen shows you sort of like a hotspot map, like a density map for where turtles are found close to shore on one of my research sites. But it gives you an idea that you know, the darker colors is where we have more animals and the lighter colors where we have less animals. It's quite straightforward. The second reason that we want to do these surveys is to find out how many animals there are, and particularly what is the trend in those animals. So just picture this: if we had, let's say, 100 animals, and we studied them the following year and we had 120 animals, and we studied them the following year and we had 150, then we could probably infer that the numbers of animals are slowly going up, which is a great thing for conservation. But similarly, if we were counting these animals over time and we were watching that the trend was going down, then that would be something of concern and something that we would need to address, something for which we would need to find some sort of a management solution. So question one, where are my animals? Question two, how many do I have? And then question three is, well, what are the threats, right? So it's all very well knowing where the animals are and how many there are, but if we don't know what threats we need to address, then it's very difficult for us to design and implement management action. So for instance, if it turns out that we have lots of dugongs in a place where we have lots of fishing, that might be something of concern. But if we have lots of dugongs over there, and we have all the fishing all the way over there, then that's probably not too much of a worry and everybody can go about their business. It's a case of being able to know both of those things at the same time in order to design the right conservation action. So what is the secret plan? Well, what we did is we have designed a series of surveys for the entire Red Sea that cover mostly the shallow water area. And I say the shallow water area because many of these species are rather lazy and they like to stay in shallower waters where they don't have to dive so deep to go and find food. There are whales and dolphins found deeper out in the deep sea, but the majority of animals that we're going to find are going to be probably in the 50 to 100 kilometers closest to the shore. So as you can see here in this graphic, I've designed this multicolored survey, and the different colors just mean these are search patterns in different areas. And if we zoom in a little bit, you can see here the search patterns around Jeddah. So just north, you have that orange zone, and south you have a white one and then a blue one. And those are the flight paths that we will use in a helicopter to fly above the sea in a U-shaped pattern. So we fly out and across, down and across, and out and across and down. And that allows us to come up with a standardized survey, and it gives us a good chance to find as many of these animals as possible. So one, we have the big picture, then we can zoom in on the individual ones. And then we can actually go and fly this. So these red lines that you see on the screen here, these are the actual flight paths that we flew in the helicopter. And there are a couple that go up and down, and don't worry too much about that. But you can see that the ones that go in and out from the shore follow very, very closely the design of the survey methods that we had come up with earlier. And so this is the way in which we go about these surveys. We use a helicopter and we take off from the ship and we climb to about 700 feet, which is nearly 200 or around 200 meters in altitude. This is the helicopter that we're using. It's a beautiful Airbus helicopter, and it's sitting here on the bow of the front part of this ship, and which makes quite interesting timing, because sometimes when the sea is a bit rolly and we want to take off or land, it gets a little bit difficult in the helicopter. Luckily we have a really good pilot. But this is the platform we use, and we take off the two back doors, and this allows the observers to have a really good view of the sea as we're flying from above. And as we go flying along these survey lines, we can go marking where we see something. So we might see, oh look, here's a dolphin, and we'll write it down. And look, here's some turtles, and we'll write those down. Oh look, here we have a shark, and we'll write that down. And we take these notes as we are flying, and all of them are linked to the position of the helicopter. So later on, when we get back onto the ship, we can put all of those onto a map. Now, one of the really cool things I think about this particular survey is the last time it was ever done was back in 1986. Yeah, a long time ago. And this graphic here just shows you some of those really old maps that were used to design those surveys, but you can see that roughly the idea is the same. They've got these lines that go in and out from shore, and we are recreating those surveys. So the great thing about this is that, remember how I said we want to see if numbers change over time? Well, now we're going to be in the position to do that because we have the numbers from 1986. Now we're going to be able to see what the numbers of 2022 look like, and to find out whether the numbers of animals has gone up or whether the numbers of animals has gone down. So what have we been finding, you might ask? Well, what this map shows, each one of these little markers on this Google Earth map is a sighting. You know, it might be a dolphin, or it might be a pod of dolphins. There might be 100, or there might be a whale, or there might be a shark. And so each one of these markers is a place where we have seen something. And if we just pull up some of the details of some of those, you can see, for instance, here on the left, one of those markers was a green turtle that we saw on the 2nd of March. It was found by Modar, and he was recording it as we were flying along. On the right, you can see that this one was a record of Indo-Pacific bottlenose dolphins. And if I go down total numbers, it says, so if you look all the way down around the middle, it says total. There were 32 animals in that sighting. So 32 dolphins all in one sighting. So each one of those markers doesn't just mean one animal. Sometimes it might mean 100 or 50 or 70 animals all seen at the same time. I'll give you a couple of photographs of some of those. So here we have a group of pan-tropical spotted dolphins. And what's really nice about these is, you know, that you can see them all jumping at different times. So it's a really interesting photograph. And the other one is that if you look carefully, you look at that pair on the left-hand side, that is a mother and a calf. So that's the mother and her baby swimming together. The next two along is also a mother and a calf. You can see that the one just to the right is much smaller than the mother who's swimming next to her. So this picture shows you that there are calves. Now, what's really cool about that is that tells us that these animals are reproducing, and that the population must be doing well if they're reproducing. If the population is stressed, or if there's some sort of a challenge, then possibly reproduction rates might go down. But in this photograph, I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 calves out of 11 animals. So that's pretty good. The next photograph, this is the dugong that I was telling you about. And this dugong feeds entirely on seagrass. So think of the grass that you have at home in the garden, or that you see on the streets, and then imagine a grass very similar to that growing underwater. It has flowers, and it does all the things you think grass does, just grows. And instead of having cows or sheep chomping down on it, in this case it has animals like the dugong. This animal is probably about 2.5 meters in length, and probably weighs, I'm going to say, at least 500 kilos. So quite a big animal. And they swim around feeding on seagrass, mostly in shallow areas. Quite a unique animal to the Red Sea, and very exciting for us to be able to find it on these surveys. This next picture is a picture of a whale shark. As I mentioned earlier, a whale shark is actually a shark, and therefore they're fish. But this is the largest fish in the ocean. So this fish can grow to be bigger than 2 normal cars, maybe, or certainly bigger than a suburban truck. And they feed on plankton. So these are microscopic little organisms that are floating in the water. They don't bite anything, they don't have big teeth, and they just go along like big vacuum cleaners, feeding on plankton as they swim through the sea. We've seen quite a few of these whale sharks on our surveys, and one of the nice things is to know that there's a big healthy population of whale sharks swimming around in the Red Sea. This next picture is quite an interesting one because we just found this 2 days ago. This is a school of devil rays. It's a type of stingray. They're about 2 meters across, so about the width of a normal car, maybe a little bit wider. And in this picture you can see, I don't know, roughly 100 of them all swimming together. And they're very close to the surface, and they're feeding on small organisms that are in the water. And this is a really interesting find because we have a few records of these rays in the Red Sea from the past, but we don't have records of them in these big numbers. So it's been really, really nice to see them. And if you think this is a good picture, I have another group that we saw later on, without a camera always, that had more than 500. So it's amazing to see this diversity of life that we're seeing in the Red Sea. And yes, we see dolphins. In this case, you can see these look like spinner dolphins. And it was a nice calm day, so we get a nice picture of them from the helicopter. That's quite a challenge at times because the helicopter is moving, it's going fast, it's vibrating, and so trying to get clear photographs of these animals is always a challenge. You can see here when the animals themselves are moving, it makes it even harder to get a very, very crisp focus on that photograph. But these zoomed in pictures, like this one you see here, these allow us to identify the species. But then if I zoom out and you can see all the number, well then this allows me to count how many there are in a pod. So you saw that record where Modard had counted 32 dolphins. Well, we do it by using these photographs, and then you can sit afterwards and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and you get the idea. You can count. Maybe about 40 roughly, but somewhere in that region. And so the zoomed in pictures allow us to get identification, and the zoomed out pictures give us the opportunity to count them and see how many there are. And then here, maybe not the best photograph, but here we can see 2 whales. These are Brutus whales, and of course the whales are underwater, so this picture is taken from way up high all the way down through the water. And the whale you can see on the right is the baby one. That's the baby. And then the mother is the one that's a little bit below her and on the left-hand side. And the big whale here is probably about 12 meters long, and the baby is about 6 to 7 meters long. So that little baby is just 6, 7 meters long, just small. This is another picture of the same whale, but taken from quite far away. As you can tell, we're in a helicopter. But we can use photographs like this, and we look at the placement of that little fin on the back, and we look at the shape of the head and the behavior, and that can help us identify the species. So in this case, if you look at the head, and you can see there's that one main line down the middle, and then just to the right and to the left, there are 2 smaller lines going down to the front. So 3 lines in total. And that is the identification character for this particular species of whale, the Brutus whale. And that's how we identify some of these, by color, by the shape of the fin, by the shape of the head, and sometimes by the behavior as well. So that's sort of the things we're finding on the survey, and we're only halfway through, so there's still a long way to go. But what do we do with this data? Well, the first thing we do is obviously, putting it together on Google Earth is one thing, but what we really want to do is collate the data so that we can have it in a computer system in such a way where we can determine what are the priority areas. And this little graphic on the right, I'll go through it in a bit more detail in a second, but this is one way in which we can analyze the data, and you'll see what I mean. But the other thing is we divide this data down by species. So we, green turtles and hawksbill turtles and spinner dolphins and Indo-Pacific bottlenose dolphins and whales and sharks, you name it. We divide them down by species. And once we know where these animals are found and once we can identify the hotspots, we can start to design management measures for the National Center for Wildlife so that these animals can be protected into the future. So let me give you a rough rundown on that graphic. And this graphic is for a place in Thailand, so don't worry about knowing exactly where it is. But I'm going to run you through it because it should give you an idea of how we can use data collected by scientists in the design of management and conservation measures. So let's look at the bottom left image, and you can see those little yellow circles. And each one of those little yellow circles is the location where a dugong was seen. Okay, so that's where the dugongs were. As we come up to the top left image with the black shaded areas, that is a hotspot map, or what we call a heat map, where the density is highest in those darker areas and the density gets less and less and less as you move further out. So you can see that there's a couple of areas where there's a lot of dugongs, and then there's some other areas where there are some dugongs but not so many. Shifting over to the top right, this now looks at fishing pressure. So nothing to do with dugongs. This is the amount of people that fish in each of these areas, and they're mapped out fisherman by fisherman. You can see obviously where the darker place is, that darker brown area, that is where the highest amount of fishing pressure takes place. All right, that's quite straightforward. So we now know where the dugongs are, and we now know where fishing is. Well, if we overlay both of those together, as in the bottom right graphic, and what we did is we came up with something that we call the traffic light signal way of prioritizing things. So the red is the highest priority for conservation. If you were a manager and you had limited resources, maybe personnel or funding or time or whatever, to invest in conservation and management action, where would you start? I'm guessing you'd start in these red areas, because that's where we have the highest overlap of dugongs and fishing. And then if you had additional resources, maybe you'd spread out into some of the orange areas and potentially the yellow areas. But you get the idea. So data like this helps us prioritize areas for conservation in the future. How would that look like in the context of the Red Sea? So this is just an example because we haven't done this analysis, but here's an image of the Red Sea that you should all recognize. And I've created an imaginary hotspot here just south of Jeddah. It's for a species of yellow bearded orange-nosed dolphins. I just made that up. But imagine that this is the hotspot where these species are found. And then we start looking at, well, where are the threats? And maybe up here there is a factory on the shoreline, but it's a threat, but there are no animals there, so it's not really a problem. But what if there was a factory down here close to the shore? In this case, you have a threat very close to the animals that is a problem, and so now we could start addressing that problem. Similarly, what if you had lots of fishing effort right in the heart of that hotspot area? Again, these are the ways in which we find out where should we be doing what. If we know that we have lots of fishing pressure in a place where we have lots of animals that need protecting, then we can start working with the fisheries department and with the fishermen to come up with ways that don't impact marine species. It's done all over the place. We can do it here. So hopefully this has given you a little bit of a very quick tour of what we're doing. We're using a really cool helicopter to fly around the Red Sea, counting some of the coolest animals on the world. Imagine having that for a job. And so once we've got that data, we can use that to help the government design conservation and management action so that these species are here 50, 100, hundreds of years into the future. Hopefully that's something you're all looking forward to. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nick. So now that we're all well-versed in megafauna surveys and perhaps inspired to design our own, it's time for our question and answer session. We will be taking questions from the YouTube chat. If you're joining us on the Zoom call, we will be looking out for questions from our Arabic-speaking students from our interpreter. So with that, I'd say we are ready to get into some questions. And while we wait for those to roll in the chat, Dr. Nick, I have one to kick us off with, which is, I'm curious if there's anything surprising that you've seen on this expedition that made you say, huh, that's interesting, or anything curious that you've come across so far?
Well, thanks, Mika, and yes, the answer is yes to all of those. The entire expedition has been extremely exciting, but probably the highlight was just yesterday when we flew over two different pairs of mother and calf whales. And what was really, really nice about this was that we found these very close to where we found some last month as well. Now that might just sound like, well, it's only 3 pairs, but here's the interesting thing about this, that in the past, our records of big whales in the Red Sea have been these opportunistic individual sightings. And many of those animals have unfortunately been dead strandings on a beach. And yet what we have found as of yesterday is that we have a population of whales that is actually reproducing and living right here in the south central part of the Red Sea off the Saudi coast. And this is hot off the press, brand new information. Some of the most exciting things for me, because all along we've been thinking that whales might just casually swim in from the south and not find a way out. But what we're finding now is, no, this is home to them and they're reproducing here. And it just blew me away. It was some of the most amazing discoveries that I think have been done in the Red Sea in the last couple of decades.
Where were those whales hiding? How did they escape our notice?
Well, so the challenge, of course, is getting offshore and looking for them. As I said a little bit earlier, the last time surveys like this were done was back in 1986. We just haven't been out there doing this work, and one of my suggestions to the National Center for Wildlife is that surveys like this need to happen at least every second year, if not every single year, because that would allow us to detect these animals. But let me tell you something, that some of the whales we were seeing yesterday were about 12 to 13 meters in length. Right? Imagine sticking 3 to 4 cars back to back. And yet, if we had not flown right over it, we wouldn't have seen it. So it was sitting underwater, and you could have driven a boat or moved around and you would not have seen it. And the only way to do it is with these aerial surveys where you get a much bigger picture, the bird's eye picture.
Speaking of the aerial surveys, are there ways that you're working with some of the other teams on board to complement the aerial survey data? I know there's a lot of eDNA happening. Um,
Yes, and those are things that will all probably take place a little bit later on in the survey. Because at the moment, the way some of the other science programs are running on the vessel, where they're collecting things like eDNA, and for those of you in the audience, imagine collecting a sample of water and a certain species of whale had just swum through there and it leaves some of its DNA behind. So now we collect that water, we test for different DNA samples, and we find out, oh look, this whale species is found in this area, or this turtle species is also found in this area. That data can all complement the aerial survey data as well. So, you know, we might find out that these whales are in even a larger area than we thought before. But that analysis of the eDNA stuff will come a little bit later on, and so it will take a little bit of time before we can match what that program has found with what we're finding on our sort of day-to-day basis.
Cameron Johnson is watching via YouTube and asks in our chat, sort of similar, is there anything you're doing in the helicopter that helps you look at smaller life forms? Or are you only focused on the big creatures here?
Well, so the focus is on the large creatures, and not because I'm picky, but more because it's very, very difficult to see these things. And you would be amazed. We're flying 200 meters above the ocean surface. And if the ocean surface is flat, calm, like you saw in some of the photographs I just showed, then it's a little bit easier to see these species. But the minute you get a few little waves, it gets very, very hard to see smaller things. I'll tell you that I have seen in other areas, I've been able to see things as small as sea snakes. We see a number of fish, we see a number of small rays while we're flying, but it's the big things that stand out. And I guess that in many ways it's a group of animals that have remained unstudied in the kingdom for so many years that I feel it's time we put data on the table so that we can make some decisions.
Okay, kind of related. Abdul Nasser has a question. Are billfish, such as sailfish and swordfish, considered megafauna?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, anything big is megafauna. We're just using the word as a bit of a catchphrase rather than have to say whales, dolphins, turtles, rays, sharks. We just use the word megafauna to put everything into a simple word. But one of the challenges, Abdul Nasser, is that the sailfish and swordfish, what happens is they jump out of the water, and as they fall down, they leave a splash, and that's all we see. You know, we don't get to see the fish afterwards. We just get to see the splash, and sometimes you can sit there and watch and wait and wait and wait, but we can't wait forever, and the aircraft is moving, so we're not always entirely sure of what it was. So with something like a ray or a turtle that spends longer on the surface, then it's much easier for us to get a positive identification.
Okay, this one is, I think, from Kalaf. They are asking about Bayada Island and the coral reefs, Al-Shab Al-Kabir area. Just if you have any more information on the biodiversity in those areas in particular.
So you're right. Actually, what this cruise is doing, it's looking at a wide variety of things. The megafauna surveys are just one component of those. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we're only halfway through the project. So there are 4 legs to the survey, and the first leg did roughly from Jeddah down to Al Gunfida. The second leg went all the way down to Farasan and worked back north towards Al Gunfida, where we finished. So that covered the southern half of the Saudi portion of the Red Sea. And in leg 3, we will go north all the way to just slightly past Yambu. And then finally in leg 4, we will cover from Yambu all the way up into the Gulf of Aqaba. So eventually we will cover the entire Red Sea, and the megafauna surveys are only part of it. While this is going on, I want you to know that there are also coral reef studies happening daily. There are seagrass studies that are happening. There are people that are diving, collecting data underwater on habitats and also on other species, other smaller species. So you are right, it's not just the big animals that are important, and you are right that there are many other places that need looking at. I will say that this area basically of Al Gunfida, what is known as the northern Farasan banks, so far has just blown my mind. We have seen whales, we have seen whale sharks, we have seen manta rays and turtles, and probably 2,000 dolphins a day. It's just the most amazing part of the Red Sea, in my opinion. It's absolutely incredible.
Okay, we have another question about one of the big animals. Dugongs play a relatively important role in the marine fauna ecosystem, and they help keep things in balance. So the question is, what is the dugong predator?
Mankind is probably the dugong's worst predator. Most of the time it's not even on purpose. The biggest problem dugongs face in the ocean is accidental bycatch. So imagine a fisherman who puts his nets out to catch fish to sell in the market, but a dugong accidentally swims into it and drowns. And the fisherman never meant for it to happen, but accidentally it did. And as we increase the amount of fishing and we increase the pressures on the ocean, then of course dugongs are also suffering from those increases. But these are extremely important members of marine ecosystems. I mentioned earlier that they feed on seagrass. And to get your head around maybe what value this is, imagine grass that grows at home. And you know that if you cut it regularly, it looks green and vibrant and healthy. But the minute you let it grow long, it gets brown and doesn't look very healthy and isn't a very productive ecosystem. Well, the same happens underwater. If we didn't have species like dugongs and green turtles going along, basically acting as underwater grass cutters, then those seagrass habitats would become degraded. What's most important is that those habitats are also places where shrimp and juvenile fish grow. And so if we don't have big species like dugongs and turtles that are cropping seagrass and maintaining that healthy ecosystem, then commercial fisheries suffer, and eventually we suffer because food doesn't end up on the table. So that's just one example of how important a dugong can be in a marine ecosystem.
I have a question. Is there, now that you're out here on the survey, you're exploring the Red Sea, you're finding out about all of this, is there something that you're excited about answering? Have you stumbled upon more research questions that you'd be interested to circle back to?
Yes, about every single 10 minutes of every day, my brain thinks like that there's something new, there's something exciting. We were flying over an island south of Al-Leith, about 50 kilometers offshore last month. And and it was just a little island. It didn't really look like much until we flew over it. And there must have been 200 turtle nests on this island. And you might be thinking, well, turtles nest on islands in the Red Sea, and that is true. But I could see the tracks of turtles that had nested the night before. And it was February. And February is way too early for turtles to be nesting in the Red Sea, and yet here they were. So there's a discovery that, we know there are turtles nesting on these islands. This particular island wasn't one of them. And certainly we weren't expecting to see tracks from the evening before. And just 2 nights ago, the ship was next to another island, and guess what? There were turtles nesting all over that too. Just amazing. Like I just did not see this coming. I figured June, July time we might start seeing turtles nesting, but here we are finding turtles early on in the year. The whales, the fact that whales are reproducing, that means here in the Red Sea we have our own population, right? This isn't something we need to think about them being up in the Arctic or the Antarctic. This is our own homegrown whales. I'm jumping like a little child.
The whales have you beaming. Okay, people are loving the dugong. So we have another dugong question. So geographically, dugongs are mostly in Australia. Where else do they live? Do they migrate and swim a long ways, either for reproduction, food, because of the seasons, or are there other considerations?
We obviously have somebody very knowledgeable in the audience to know that the biggest dugong population is in Australia. So well done to you for knowing that. But interestingly, the world's second largest population of dugongs is in the Arabian Gulf, and it's shared by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. And those dugongs live in that south west corner of the Gulf and move around a little bit. In terms of movements and migrations, dugongs won't really move unless they have to. So the only times where we really start to see dugong migrations is when the food that they were feeding on starts to become scarce. And so long as dugongs have access to healthy seagrass, they're not going to go anywhere. They're going to stay put. However, we do have records of dugongs that move 600, 700 kilometers up and down the coast of Australia in search of food. And those are big movements, but I can tell you that in the Arabian Gulf there were some dugongs that were tracked by the Abu Dhabi Environment Agency. And those dugongs moved something like 30 kilometers and 70 kilometers, practically nothing. And the reason they didn't move very far is because there was plenty of food. And so they weren't really migrating, they were just using different feeding patches at different times of the year. So provided we can maintain healthy seagrass ecosystems, then I don't think we're really under any threat of dugongs migrating and leaving. The only last part of that question that I think is another really interesting part of the question is this concept of, do they move for reproduction? And they might or they might not, but you are correct in thinking that they do have some preferred areas for reproduction. And normally those would be sheltered areas, maybe where they can get away from sharks or from orca whales, in order to give their offspring the best chance at growing up and becoming a little bit bigger. So they might not move very far, but they might move into sheltered waters where they can offer a little bit more protection to the young.
Okay, this is a fun one. This will be our last question for the evening. This is from Jamal. What is the difference in your experience between the bottom of the Red Sea and the Arabian Gulf?
That's like saying the difference between day and night. They are such different bodies of water. The Arabian Gulf is relatively shallow. I say shallow, 50 to 100 meters is very shallow when you think that the Red Sea can go down, a couple of thousand meters. The sediment seabed in the Gulf, it's a very soft mud, sand, sediment seabed, whereas the Red Sea, think of it as being a very, very deep, narrow body of water with very, very highly encrusted coral sides on either side. So very, very diverse habitats, so different. Clear waters that the Gulf doesn't have and that allow the development of all kinds of corals. So they are just literally, day and night in terms of comparing ocean bodies. That said, I find the Gulf fascinating because of the fact that it's this very unique shallow habitat. For those of you who are not aware, the Gulf surface waters can change by over 10 to 15 degrees between winter and summer. And that, I can tell you, is not something you could endure in a shower. Right? When we take a shower, when we see a 2-degree change in temperature, we jump out saying it's too cold or it's too hot. But in the Red Sea, imagine that in the Arabian Gulf, imagine there are species that are able to withstand those dramatic shifts in temperature and still reproduce and survive.
Okay, I have a soft spot for this question, and then this will really be the final the final question, if you're okay for one more.
I'm good. I'm good. It's nice to see people have an interest.
These are great questions. This one really, this is one of our Arabic speaking students, Sovia, our interpreter. When we compare the marine fauna population in the Red Sea from, say, 3 or 4 centuries ago, how different is it to now? And are there any species that are, way less, or do we have any new guests?
Yeah, and for as good as that question is, I don't have a good answer for you. And the real reason for that is not because of anything other than people just weren't doing these sorts of surveys in the past. People, a lot of the old expeditions would collect a species and it would end up in a museum in Europe somewhere. Sometimes it might have been lost or it wasn't curated properly. And we know this, for instance, for whales. We know the historic record for whales is in many ways atrocious. But another thing is, let me give you an example that about 300 years ago, there were some deep sea surveys in the Red Sea where they dropped this big, massive steel dredge, big, heavy, clunky thing that weighed more than 2 cars, and they dropped it to the seabed and they pulled it along and they brought it up, and half of the things inside would have been crushed to death or they would have been unrecognizable. And just this morning, we were sending a $3 million ROV down to the seabed that was picking something up very delicately with a pair of pincers. And yesterday morning, we had submarines diving to the depths of the Red Sea, looking at doing the same thing. So think of the way technology has changed over the years, that back then we were brutes and just, force. Today we're more like very, very delicate surgeons. And so the discoveries of today are orders of magnitude more advanced than the discoveries of the past. And because of technology, this technology that allows us to get to the depths in manned submarines and that allows us to collect water and DNA. Who would have thought of collecting eDNA 200 years ago? So the advances in technology mean we're finding things today that 300 years ago people didn't even know were out there waiting to be discovered. So I'd love to be able to tell you that things have changed dramatically from 300 years ago till today, but I really don't, because I can't, because we don't have the detail that we can collect today. What I can say, just to round off this question and discussion, is that when I was born, there were about 2 billion people on the planet. And today there are about 8 billion people on the planet. And that means that there is 4 times more pressure on natural resources than there used to be. And yet, that does not mean that fish have started to reproduce 4 times faster, or that turtles lay 4 times more eggs, or that whales can lay 4 times more the number of calves. So while the natural world has remained in its pristine state doing what it did, we humans have grown in this absolutely incredible, at this absolutely incredible rate. And all I can tell you is that the pressures that we exert on natural ecosystems have tremendously increased. And I think that that's a caution that we all need to keep in mind.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you're out there surveying things and designing conservation measures to help those populations. I was really excited to hear about the turtle nesting in great abundance. I guess it is time for us to start wrapping things up. So Dr. Nick, thank you so much for taking the time with us this evening. Thank you to the National Center for Wildlife for partnering with us on this expedition. Thank you to all of the students for asking your excellent questions. I'm really glad you all were here with us tonight as well. For everybody watching, I want to say Ramadan Mubarak. And once again, we're so happy to have you with us. We'll be hosting more live talks with scientists on board OceanXplorer as the expedition continues. So you can keep up with us on our social media channels where we are at OceanX. Thank you all again so much and have a wonderful evening.